I want to go over the shader breakdown really quickly before I talk about textures. So these might look complicated, but as most node networks, it's complicated unless you were working in it and setting it up yourself. So I have one for the iris material and one for the cornea material. I'm using the Llama material inside of RenderMan. So it's essentially, here's the shader, here's a node that combines two material lobes together, and essentially I have the cornea, which is a glass, and then I have the sclera, which is essentially going to be more of like a skin subsurface material with a reflection on top of it. Llama has like these different shading nodes broken out into blocks, so you add them on together instead of having like one a monolithic shader that has all the different settings already built into it, which just gives you more flexibility to what you can create. And so this mixer right here that's going from the sclera to the cornea is being controlled by this mask. So we have this cornea mask, which is essentially a ramp. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. For the iris, it's essentially a more, a more traditional material, right? Because I'm not transitioning between two different material types. I'm just essentially having it as one material. So again, I have an iris material. We also have displacement attached to it. And don't worry about this one. This is just for the viewport. But for our material, we have, again, the iris has like a skin-like subsurface scattering and has its own reflection. That's what we use for that caustic. I could have called it caustic. And then we can talk more about this stuff as we get closer. But you'll notice that I use a lot of different ramps for this. And that just lets me identify components or parts of the iris to kind of mask them off or add light or add shadow interactively without having to go back out and texture, even though I did texture create a base texture maps for it. Okay, so talking about texturing. So really for mine, I'm only going to focus on doing the textures for the iris. Like I said, I'm doing a stylized character, so I'm not going to worry too much about the texture on sclera. I don't want to get all those veins because it looks kind of gross on a stylized character. If I come into here, might be able to see, I'm going to pull it up on this. So this is a reference texture map that I'd found actually from another tutorial. And you can see he painted in a lot of color variation and breakup to this. So he actually took like an image of, I think the side of an eyeball, and he just essentially stamped it in. You see a lot of repeating in there and getting that color variation. So he uses that for the sclera, and you can see he's doing that radial kind of transition as well. And here's his iris texture, kind of taking a very similar approach. So we're just going to focus on the iris. You should always have plenty of reference no matter what you're doing. I have this eyeball essentially folder that I've created or collected stuff over time. Some of it is just for reference. Some of it is actually to use the images for texturing. So you can see I have this. This would be an example that that guy used to create that sclera texture map. Is you could use something like this as a texture map from 3DSK where they remove the specular. They're using polarized photography, or cross polarization. Yeah, cross polarization. I completely blanked on the term. To remove that outward specular reflection. There's still a little bit of it, but it essentially lets you separate the diffuse and the specular out so they're not sitting on top of each other. So you can use these images or understand the actual diffuse subsurface interaction color information without the reflections getting in the way. So you could grab this and then you can use that to stamp in there. So we're using this we could use something like this for the iris, right? So I could actually take this image in here and I can cut it out and bring it into Photoshop and use that as my base for my iris. You can find high resolution iris images online. They're actually fairly easy to find. So these ones I just found randomly on a website of a photographer who was just posting these images. So he would take high resolution images of irises and then would essentially isolate them out. So you have all this really interesting detail. You can go a different route, which is pretty common nowadays, which is to use pre-existing images and maps. So this is from Texturing XYZ. So Texturing XYZ is a scan data website, and one of their more popular functions that they do is they create really high resolution detailed displacement maps as well. So they get some really good, they're well known for their skin data, but they also have animal information like animal skin, animal features as texture maps, and then we have this eyeball pack. And so they have these really great eyeball packs, and they're already centered, and they actually line up with each other, right? So we have a color map here, and then we have the displacement. This is a multi-channel displacement where the different color channels have a different displacement map in them. So one's going to have really big details, one's going to have medium details, and one's going to have small details. And they also have like a bump map for super, super fine details, much like a normal map. And here's like a broad, just general displacement. So this is a really big displacement if you didn't want to use multi-channel displacement texturing. So to texture this iris inside of a program like Photoshop, then I would bring this out as a UV snapshot, and that's actually what I'm going to do. Of course, you could bring this into a program like Mari or Substance Painter, and you can use some kind of projection method to project onto the 3D model itself or onto the UV space. You could do that in either program. Mari has really, really nice projection tools that I like. So I'm going to be doing this in Photoshop though. So actually, let me go ahead and add a subdivision to this because those UVs, I don't really want them to shift around too much from the UV layout export to this one. So I'm going to go ahead and just subdivide that one. So I'm just going to select it smooth. It's getting a little dense, but I'm going to do offline rendering, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to go ahead and modify, image, UV snapshot. And I'm going to go ahead and put this into a folder. So this is going to be the I folder. Ooh, I got a lot of stuff on here. Where is it? iStemo. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the images folder. I'm going to make it out UV. I'm not going to make it a .iff file though. So we're going to go ahead and click save. And I'm going to change this to something like, we want a PNG, so we want transparency. I'm going to click apply. I'm going to make it a 4K map, so we'll just start with that way. I don't have to scale it up. And click apply. So I went ahead and saved that image. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and open up Photoshop and bring in that UV layout. Here I went ahead and opened my UV layout inside of Photoshop. Here it is. It's a PNG, so it has transparency, has white lines, and then I just added a black layer underneath it so you can see it. It was a little dim, so what I did is I just went ahead and did a hue saturation or some other color correct and just brightened it up a little bit. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bring in an image. So I'm going to start with an image of an iris, and I'm going to warp it to the shape of this iris and just try to match it to my iris. So when I load it in, it's going to fit my iris model. And so it's going to look a bit something like this, right? Where we have this iris in, we position it into there, and then we either use Puppet Warp or Liquify, and then it's going to match our UV layout so that it's going to line up with our actual topology. So this is one I've already done. I'll walk really quickly through this, kind of what I was doing, right? So you can see here I added a component down here to lighten the bottom area where I essentially made the iris darker at top and lighter at bottom just to kind of reinforce that effect of the caustic. Then I added, just to kind of stylize it a little bit more, I went ahead and started adding in like these graphic radial lines. So it wasn't just like all super gross detail. For a stylized character, it's a little gross. And I just kept putting on layer after layer after layer to get the color and image I wanted. So you can see then I'm starting to mask off those other parts with some radial ramps. And this is the final result I had for my diffuse. So yeah, we're going to do something very similar for the other one. So let's go ahead and load in our texture images. I'm going to go to File, Place Embedded. So I'm going to start with the diffuse image, press Enter, and I'm going to go ahead and do Place Embedded. I'm going to use just the plain displacement. I'm not going to use the multi-channel displacement. And then I'm going to go ahead and do Place Embedded, the bump map. Press Enter. I want these to be smart objects because this is specifically for Photoshop. I want these to be smart objects because then what I can do is I can make modifications to one layer and so it matches my UV shell, and then I can apply those same exact modifications to the other ones just by essentially copying the smart filters from one to the other. But first I'm going to go ahead and transform at the same time. So I'm going to select all of them. I'm going to hold Alt. I'm going to scale this up. I'm going to try to match these to my UV layout. So I'll go ahead and just try to center that right around here. Get those to overlap a little bit on the boundary, and then press Enter. And it's a pretty good start, but we're just going to modify this a little bit so it fits just slightly better. So I like to do this on the color map. So there's two different ways we can do this. We could use the Puppet Warp tool, or we could use the Liquify. I'll start with Puppet Warp just to show you what that looks like. So we're going to go to Puppet Warp while selecting this. And you'll see while I'm doing Puppet Warp, well, actually it won't let me until I'm done with it, there's going to be smart filters on here. So the way Puppet Warp works is essentially it has this like triangulated mesh on it that breaks our image into, and then we put these pins into the model and we essentially shift around and stretch and change the shape of our object using this mesh. I'm of course going to hide that mesh. And so I like to go ahead and set a few on the outside. So I'll just go do a few around the outside just to kind of hold it in place. And then we're really going to focus on just the pupil transition area. I think I can get rid of that one. There we go. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is we have to keep in mind that this part right here is essentially our that actual inside edge. So the outer edge that we can see is up here. So what we could do is actually, let me go ahead and get rid of these really quickly. I'm going to go ahead and actually add one on the inside of the image and on the outside of the image, because then what I can do is I can pull this up here, and then I can still have some texture overlapping around and bend around the edge. So I can do something like that. So we'll just select on the bottom, select up here, and then just pull that out a little bit. So we get some of that inner color part, or more of it overlapping onto the front face that we're actually going to see. Do the same thing here, maybe do that. And I'm just trying to get this so that it more or less lines up with the center pupil. If this wasn't, if it was kind of oblong, I might shift this over just so it lines up with the actual shape. But actually for this one, to be completely honest, I wouldn't have to do a whole lot to modify it to make it look good. I'm just going to stretch that, maybe stretch that in a little bit. Same thing with this one. And one more time. Okay, and we'll take a look at Liquify in a second. For these ones, I'm just going to make sure that this overlaps the outside. Okay, so just so it kind of spills out on the outside a little bit. There we go. Okay, and then just press enter to apply it. If there were any parts that I didn't like, so you can see this is one problem with the Puppet Warp is that, you know, you're going to get like these bends in between them. The nice thing about doing it this way though is I can easily just jump back into Puppet Warp and edit that shape because it's still a smart filter and make any adjustments. But the one thing about the, like I was saying about the Puppet Warp is you do tend to get these kind of like straight lines showing up. That's a little annoying and kind of a struggle to kind of adjust and fix. But once I'm done with it, I can press enter. We'll take a look at Liquify in a second, but in order to copy this onto my other ones, because this one's been adjusted, but the other ones have not. So you can see they're slightly different in positioning. But I want them to line up, right? If I have like a little fibrous band right here, I want my bump map and my displacement map to also actually have those in the same location. So I'm going to go ahead and select this and hold Alt and drag my filter onto this other layer. So sometimes, or actually a lot of times, it's going to take a little bit to process it. So you can see now those are actually the exact same warping because it just applied the exact same warp that I just did there. And I'll do the same thing on that displacement layer. And so we'll just get rid of those. And there we go. Okay, so let's take a look at the Liquify. I'm going to do it really quickly, but it's the same procedure. So I'm going to go ahead and hide this one for now. And I'm going to go to Filter, Liquify. And so this one's a little bit more just like using brushes to modify it. Before I do that, let me go ahead and get the turn back on that wireframe. So go ahead and Filter, Liquify. We use the Warp tool. I am using Show Backdrop. And I'm going to use the layer in front, which should be maybe layer 1, or is it layer 2? And we're going to put this in front, and let's bring that in. There we go, layer 1 opacity there. There we go. Just because I want to make sure I see this wireframe to warp to. So I just made sure my UV layer was in front of my current warping layer, and then I'm just set the opacity 100%. I'm going to use the warping tool, use the brackets to kind of change the scale. I'm going to do really big soft changes. Okay. Let's go ahead and bring that opacity down a little bit. I think that's going to prevent me from actually seeing my progress. So this just lets me do like this big warp kind of soft gooey adjustment. to my texture. So if you prefer working this way and you don't really like how the Puppet tool works, then you can totally use this one. And it's a little bit more artistic and easier to work with. And I would say okay, and then I would do the exact same thing. It would copy it down into my smart filters, and I'd copy it down to these ones. That whole process is the exact same. One thing I did want to mention is by using that warp and keeping those as smart objects, I can line these up perfectly. But if I wanted to make any modifications, so for instance, oh, why is that not turned on? There we go. But if I wanted to make any modifications to this, like if I wanted to maybe patch up this area down here, I didn't like this area and I wanted to use this area right here, then we would have to do some tricky work to copy that same effect onto the displacement and bump map. So it's just a thing that, you can only go so far into editing this and keeping this workflow here to link them together. If you want to do something really special or do a lot of editing, then, it gets a little bit more tricky, or you just kind of have to live with breaking it a little bit. So if I went ahead and duplicated this layer, say okay. In this case, what I might do is just for simplicity's sake, I might do something like rasterize my layer, which just makes it a non-smart object, which just makes it easier to edit with. I'm just going to rotate it. So let's say I want to get turn that brown kind of area that's at the bottom into blue, right? So then what I do is just add a mask, invert that mask so the whole thing is hidden. And then I would just use paint white into the mask to reveal in that area, right? So if I wanted to edit that and get something, so I got rid of that brown part, right? Then I could do that and stitch on some images. But like I said, we have to keep in mind that that no longer really lines up with the bump map and displacement map if we do it that way. Okay, for the rest of it, I just wanted to show it in here. A displacement map is the same as the other one, right? Where I just line up a displacement map and I just use a mask to fade off the edges. Well, while we're at the color, I did use these radial gradients to essentially block in and hide off the texture at certain areas, like along the edges and down here, so that, I can kind of control the color and the information that's going down into the pupil and bleeding out to the edges. If you're going more realistic, you probably don't have to do that. But I was going stylized and I really want to control those shapes so that they're really clean. And so my specular is essentially like a desaturated version with like a slight modification. So again, this is going stylized. I wanted a specific effect. So I just did like a black and white layer. I added a gradient so it doesn't reflect as much up here. And then in this case, I'm using this not as color. I'm actually using this for a mask for my reflectivity. So normally if you're doing physically based rendering, you would want your reflectivity to match the actual index of refraction of that material. So let's say like 1.35 or 4. But in this case, I'm going to be doing that fake specular effect. And so I'm going to just use this as a mask to get a little texture in the reflections and then just dial in that reflectivity so I can get a little bit more brightness in there so I get that glowy hit. Okay. And then of course I have my displacement. And again, I wanted, my map was getting these little, kind of like, little arms and fingers going into the pupil that when I displaced it, you could see it kind of showing up in the model. So I wanted to get rid of that. So I just added in a 50% gray fade off, because when you're working with displacement, 50% gray is just flat. Okay. So those are my texture maps.